today. Wow. We should have this out on the lawn if we could find a lawn. I just looked at the syllabus for the first time in some time. And I see here, week 6, the home stretch, status of the race, do we know the winner? Well, we'll talk about that this morning. I want to, I know I had mentioned to you that we were going to have a presentation by Anya Donovan, who's the chair of the ethics department here. But I got an email from her yesterday or the day before saying that she had been called to a meeting with the provost. And my son, who's a professor down at Georgetown, tells me that when you're called to a meeting with the provost, you go to the meeting. So I don't know whether we'll be able to reschedule that, but in any event. So I thought this morning, since we last met, it's been 2 weeks. I don't know what kind of a withdrawal feeling, if any, you may have had. I had some, as you may have gathered from a few of the interim communications. But since that time, we've had a debate, if we can remember that debate, and there's going to be a final debate tonight that may be memorable. And then, of course, we've had a whole bunch of other things that have developed in that time. And I'm not sure that it's particularly useful at this point kind of to go back and rehash those things. But I think I do want to talk in our session today about the debate tonight and what we might expect or might think will happen, and what might surprise us. Will anything surprise us? I'm not sure. I did see this morning, and many of you may also have, that Mr. Trump has invited Mr. Obama's half-brother, who lives in Kenya, but who is a citizen of the United States, to sit in the box, Mr. Trump's so-called box. And then I saw that Hillary has a couple of Republican billionaires who she's invited to sit in her box. I have to say I don't get this. And it's like, you know, it's like kindergarten stuff. But in any event, so we will come to the debate, tonight's debate, and perhaps in doing that we'll be obviously able to refer back to the second debate and to the now famous or infamous tape, which was locker room talk, depending upon, of course, which locker rooms you happen to be in. And so I thought we would start this morning first. For those of you who may remember, there was a question in the last class about the 12th and the 20th Amendment. And I was, in any event, I wanted just to make a quick statement. Obviously, they're actually relatively short. You can certainly read them if you haven't memorized them already. But they both obviously relate to the Electoral College, which was why we were talking about them in the last session. The 12th Amendment is the one which changed the process of Electoral College voting. Prior to that, in the original Constitution, the language of the Constitution, the electors voted for 2 people for president, number 1 and number 2. There was no separate vote for vice president. And that became a problem in 1800 when the Electoral College when the election of the presidency went into the Congress. And so there was an amendment, the 12th Amendment, which said that the electors had to vote separately for the president and for the vice president. So then the 20th Amendment, which came much later, basically simply changed the dates for the beginning and end of terms for Congress and for the president and vice president. And as you are probably aware, those dates are different. The presidency and the vice presidency end at noon on the 20th of January, and the congressional terms end at noon on the 3rd of January. So there is this interesting time between the 3rd and the 20th where theoretically interesting questions could arise, which I don't want to get into today. But just to clarify what those two amendments related to.
So why did they do it?
Was there a subsequent amendment which, I remember Franklin Roosevelt, when he was, I've read this now, he did not assume the presidency until, I believe, March 4th.
That's right. And that was this, the 23rd Amendment, the 20th Amendment, was designed to alleviate this problem of this lame duck problem between the election in November and somebody taking the office in March. So they pushed it back to January 20th. So there was, you're absolutely right, it was March for until that amendment came.
So what was the theory of making those dates different for the legislators and the president?
I actually don't know the theory of making them different.
I mean, why? Doesn't make any
but they have been, they are, and I think we did talk about this interesting question of what would happen if, let's say, well, we know that on the 19th of December, the Electoral College meets. And then the Electoral College in each state sends their certificates to Congress, among other people. And then after the new Congress is inaugurated on the 3rd of January, their first order of business is the review and approval of the electoral votes.
Well, that's probably why.
So it would make sense that that would happen prior to the inauguration of the new president. And whether they fully needed 2 weeks, you know, it seems to me that's probably not an unreasonable time. But I think that basically is why it wasn't on the same day. So let's take a look first, because I think that we ought to, I think it's worth looking at the current polls. I think yesterday I was on the computer for a bit, and I think 538 changed their map, I think at least 3 times. I don't know if any of you followed that.
It's already changed from what you have.
Has it? So,
Well, that one has Arizona as almost...
well, getting bluish, as they say.
Bluish.
Bluish. So, anyway, let's run this down and see, because this is the famous handcuffs here. What's the current gross number now?
88.1 to 11.9.
Okay, so Mr. Silva takes this seriously, as you can see, and the computer is generating thousands of pages of information, and somebody is putting them up. So the point is here, you know, some pundits are beginning to say, is this just a victory or is this a landslide? So my own take at the moment is, let's not get too excited quite yet. First of all, we have the debate tonight. And again, we'll talk about that. But I come back to our famous, what I still think are the three critical key words in who is going to win this election. Change, which is what Mr. Trump clearly is running on, and which Hillary is having a very hard time navigating in terms of trying to define how she will change anything in Washington when she's been part of it for so long and when she's attached herself to Mr. Obama so close. Second of all, crisis. In the next 19 days, we have Mr. Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. I wonder what he does there. But in any event, he's been there, what's it, 5 years? I think so. And there's some conversation that I think the Ecuadorian government is now claiming that they were contacted by our State Department asking them to cut off his internet connection. Imagine without it being there without an internet connection. And the State Department denied any such request. In any event, crisis, clearly. You know, we have, there's a force in Iraq now going toward Mosul. I mean, if there were a disaster there of some kind, it certainly isn't going to be good regardless. But if there's a disaster in or around Mosul in the interim, what impact could that have on the election? In my view, such an impact would not be positive for Hillary. So that's the crisis. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is who's going to come out and vote in this election. I think here in New Hampshire, we're going to have a big turnout. New Hampshire traditionally has historically high turnouts vis-a-vis the rest of the nation. But I think we're going to have a big turnout. And indications are that people are already voting in a dozen states, as you may well know. There have been, I think, close to a couple of million votes cast. And exit polls, which of course are not really exit polls, all you know is whether the ballots cast are Republican, Democrat, or Independent, seem to show that Democratic votes, as opposed to Republican votes, are much higher than you would anticipate. So, but let's take a look at this and see what's happening here. We'll look at a couple of these. This is the, these are the swing states. And note here, as you can see, this is the blue and the red. And most of these, outside of Iowa, Georgia, and Arizona, show fairly strong margins, relatively speaking, for Hillary. So if we move this along, this is the map, the electoral map, which is not quote-unquote the map of the United States, but shows the states in relationship to the size of their electoral vote. And again here, not surprisingly, we have the center, south center, pretty much in red, a little bit up here in the mountain states here, and then the blue in the east and the west. What are they calling it now? Bi-coastal elite, I think is the phrase that Mr. Trump and others So that's what that looks like. And now this is another way of looking at it, where the most blue states are here, and this snake goes along. And then this is the 269th vote. Here they have it in Minnesota and Nevada. And these are the votes on the other side. And then you'll see this is the so-called power index, the tipping point chance of Florida likely being the tipping point, Nevada, and New Hampshire. Smaller states can be a power index of both. So as we run this down, we see Mr. Johnson seems to be fading. I heard somewhere this morning that in at least one state, it may be Utah, I'm not sure. He's actually running, well, in Utah, he's running behind McMullen, I think. But he's running behind Jill Stein in at least one state, which to me is interesting. And as I said, his real goal is to stay above 5% of the total vote, because then the party gets financial help in the next election, which they certainly need. So, in any event, that's one analysis. And I wanted to run through another one with you. So this is the New York Times, and they are now saying that Hillary has a 92% chance to win. And their handcuffs here are a little wider, as you can tell. And then they have this summary of how the race has shifted, which you can see. Clinton's chances in Georgia going up substantially, in Ohio a bit, in Colorado 94%, 79% in Florida. This is interesting. They have her 79% is a pretty strong percentage in the state, and yet Mr. Rubio is well ahead of the Senate candidate in Florida. And indeed, while there is still some hope for the Democrats to take over the Senate, there are certainly some places where the Republican Senate candidate is running way ahead of Mr. Trump in those states, in Ohio, in Florida, and I think in some other places. Here's Clinton's chances in New Mexico. 98%. To me, that's a big number. Wisconsin, 92%. North Carolina, 71%. Pennsylvania, 95%. And in New Hampshire, they have her at 91%. Not all the polls, I think, have agreed with that number in New Hampshire. And then, what the Times does, as you know, for those of you who follow this, is that they split the states up with those that are much more Democratic, somewhat more like the country as a whole, and this is the swing state area, a few here as well, and then the Republican states. Note that there are still more states that are Republican than Democrat. So as we move down here, the Times says that there's a 57% chance of the Democrats winning the Senate. And then we come down here to what I think is an interesting, this is the Times summary of all of the major aggregators or polls. And so here is the Times itself. Here is 538, Huffington Post. These are the bookies. And then somebody asked me earlier about this is Larry Sabato from Crystal Ball. And then this is Cook. This is the Princeton poll. Somebody asked me about that earlier. And then, of course, as you get down the states, I think this is an interesting exercise. And actually, so what this shows by each one of the polls is how they feel state by state. And so you can really get you can really drill down here. And so what they show here is that New Hampshire is the final 4 votes to get Hillary over to over 270. And you'll note that you know, these are pretty strong positives all the way through here. They're not all solid blue, and some of these are leaning and could conceivably go the other way. But I think this state-by-state analysis is an interesting approach and shows and then obviously it gets seriously red down here. Now there's conversation about some of these states. Well, I don't know about many of these states. I don't think there's conversation about any of those states. But there is conversation about Arizona. There's conversation about Georgia. There's conversation about Utah, South Carolina, maybe Missouri. There's actually some conversation about Texas. I can't really bring myself to believe that that's going to happen. But what's happening in Texas in terms of their population is pretty amazing, because the percentage of Hispanic votes in Texas is increasing at a very remarkable rate. And in the next election, the number of white voters in Texas is going to be at a disadvantage for the first time in history. So one of the, and I think you probably saw, one of the questions that the Hillary campaign was discussing was whether they should devote resources to Texas, to Arizona, to Georgia.
I think they should.
And so what's the benefit of doing that? Does it make any difference if you win, that you win by 60 electoral votes or 160 electoral votes or 200 electoral votes? Is that meaningful?
Yes.
It should. I don't know whether it will.
In this election, it definitely is, because if he's talking about it being rigged, then the greater the disparity between their votes says, no, can't possibly be rigged.
The harder it is to maintain that position. Yes?
Of course, it doesn't matter if you have 271 votes, you're the president. It seems if you have 358 votes, but it does matter for the next election. If they're going to get experience on the ground, start developing their networks now, they'll be better tuned up for 2020.
Okay. Yes, Pete?
I think the big problem is that whomever wins will have over 60% of the population opposed to them, or not trust them, let's put it that way. And so the more votes that you have, the easier it is for you to argue against what will be an obvious concern. And if over 60% don't trust.
Where are you getting that 60%?
Where is that 60%
From the papers.
No, I'm
Well,
not
that's
saying in the papers.
Are you, wait a minute, are you talking about
trust
trustworthy?
The trust factor.
The trust factor.
Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are not trusted by 60% of the population of the country.
That's not the numbers I've seen.
Well, maybe not.
Well, there's significant numbers.
Please excuse me for recording what I read.
Well, no, it's okay. So I think, you know, I think this is an interesting question. One of the things that Trump is promoting is the system is rigged. And I want to talk today a bit about that. This is a real slap in the face at our system of democracy. And because we've had, over time, an orderly transfer of power, even during very difficult and close and hard-fought elections.
Civil War.
So, Sam?
Like the Civil War. I mean,
Well, that's of course the obvious example. There have been others.
The media keeps showing Al Gore after he, quote, lost, how gracious he was. But they're also showing a number of Republican elected officials who are angry because some of them are in charge of elections in their states. And they're angry that he's saying this because they said the same thing. It's a challenge to our democracy. So these are Republican elected officials, not Democrats. And they might even be supporting Trump for all I know. But they take offense and umbrage at him saying that because they also see he's going after the people in charge of the elections.
So let me throw this out as a thought. We really don't have a single election going on. We have 3,000 elections going on November 8th, which culminate through the counties and the states, and then in the Electoral College, into a final vote total. But in fact, within almost every state, there are multiple elections. And, you know, here in New Hampshire, you know, the town of Hanover does its thing. We're down in Grantham, we do our thing. I mean, there are dozens of districts, and as I say, some 3,000 throughout the country. Obviously, in the bigger states, or those states that have more people, they have more districts. But so this is an interesting problem, and I think that it's going to speak to the question of what happens in a couple of weeks when the results are known. What will Donald Trump, if he loses, what will he do? Will he concede? Does it make any difference if he concedes? What mischief could be generated? Sandy.
I might be wrong in this, to ask your question. Aren't most of the states controlled, the electoral districts controlled by Republicans? Is the majority of the state electoral boards controlled by Republicans?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
But the real question here, or the point, which I think you're getting to, is that really, you know, Mr. Trump is a litigious figure. We know that he has been involved in well over, it's documented, well over 5,000 lawsuits in his illustrious career. Some 3,500 of which he's brought, and some 1,500 of which other people have brought. And it is not true that he has never settled a case. He's settled hundreds of cases. But in any event, each state will make their own decisions about their own votes. So if Mr. Trump really wanted to cause some real problem, he would have to bring actions in those states. 50? No, he wouldn't. There's no need to bring 50, but he could bring actions in X number of states for a recount, for example. What is interesting, and I think important, is that the law, the federal law states, that the states have to make decisions by certain dates, and those dates are pretty restrictive. I think we've already said the Electoral College meets on December 19th. The states have to have resolved those problems before that date. And if they haven't, then they can ask for an extension, which they may or may not get, or that dispute will go to Congress for a resolution. Nobody wants to send a dispute to Congress on this matter for a resolution. I don't care what side they're on.
Is it just the House or the entire Congress?
No, it's just the House for the presidency. But the Senate, you know, depending upon how this worked out, the Senate, if no one got a majority, the Senate would make the decision on the vice president. And there could be 3 candidates in the House. If Mr. McMullen or Mr. Johnson got electoral votes, they could be considered candidates. They would be. But in the Senate, only 2 candidates can be considered. So Mr. Well or I don't know who McMullen's VP is, would not have a chance. You have a candidate.
This is the new House?
The new House.
The new House.
That's right. The new House is the House that will meet and vote on that. Sam?
Well, my guess is the new House will be slightly more Democratic.
Yeah.
I think they're going to make some gains. And it seems to me there's enough, quote unquote, sane Republicans that can't stand Trump either. I can't believe that in the House they couldn't. Is it a simple majority or 2/3?
No, it is. What happens is each delegation meets and votes. So in California, there are, what, 56, I think, some such number of reps. And they would vote, and they get a vote.
So how many of those votes does it take?
So it takes a majority.
Not 2/3.
No, it takes a majority. So in New Hampshire, we have 2 votes. And as I said before, if the...
How do you get 2 votes?
No, because we have 2 congressmen. 2 congressmen in the House is all we have. We have...
No, but you said California gets 1.
No. They have 55 congressmen. They get 1 vote. We have 2 congressmen and get 1 vote. The congressmen have to agree in New Hampshire because otherwise we get a goose egg. We don't vote.
If it's 1-1.
So if Mr. Ginter gets reelected down and Annie Custer gets reelected, then they would have to agree or New Hampshire would get. So that's interesting. Yes, Bob.
Does this only occur if someone does not have the requisite 270? Or
Yes.
so if someone has 275, then you don't go through
You're
the
right.
exercise.
It doesn't happen. So, but as I say, so that what Trump or the Republican Party or both would have to do, if should they be so inclined, is to request recounts or bring an action to effectively do that in certain states, certain districts, and the state then has to make a decision. Yes, it's worth doing. No, it's not worth doing. And in any event, it has to be done, as I say, between November 8th and December 17th. So that's not much time.
Who decides that?
I'm sorry?
Who decides if they want to do the recount?
Well, the state would make the determination.
Yeah, but when
And
you say
initially, it
state,
would be the election department. And then, if the Republican committee didn't agree and wanted to pursue it, they'd have to bring it to court. And, you know, they'd bring it to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, let's say. Going back to the problem in Florida, in 2000, the original motion, I think, was brought in the Florida Supreme Court. And so, but as I say, this is a very limited period of time. So I think these are interesting questions. Does a candidate have to concede? I think the answer is there's no legal requirement for a candidate to concede. But in our history, a candidate has always conceded, some more graciously than others. There's I saw there was a California state senator back in the 60s who, after the election was over, said, the voters have spoken, those bastards. So clearly, he wasn't intending to run for re-election. Or famously, Dick Nixon, when he lost as governor in California in 1962, said in a press conference, you're not going to have Nixon to kick around anymore. Well, we did.
Unfortunately, we all remember that.
And so, in any event, I think, and actually I've got that tape of Al Gore. I think it's worth watching, and maybe we'll watch it after the break, because I think it was a remarkable short speech that he made. John Kerry, I think, made some very interesting and positive remarks when he lost his election, with words to the effect that one of the great things about our election process was that when you woke up the next morning, everyone was still an American. I find it hard to believe that Mr. Trump would be able to make that kind of a presentation. Sam.
I know we're talking here about just the electoral college and all that, but getting back to fraud, it seems to me I read somewhere that there's been studies, that involve thousands and thousands of cases. And out of all of that, they found 32 pieces that might be fraud. 32 out of thousands. How does Trump get away with, there's massive voter fraud in this country?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I want to, we are going to talk, I'm going to show you some, I think we can get out of here. Let me turn to kind of come around to that question that Sam has asked here. You know, the idea that the system is rigged, I think is really, it's not defensible. However, the fact is, and I think we've talked about some of this, is that the system is very fragile. And in some places, not necessarily, well, in some geographical places, and in some ways, it is broken and needs to be fixed. So here's a quite recent elections performance analysis that was done by the Pew Trust that I thought had some interesting revelations. And so let me they studied the 2008, 10, 12, and 14 elections. And here's the first chart. This is the, here, let me do the, this is the sample between, this is the difference between 2008 and 2012. And these little dots on the chart, which are probably a little hard to read, are the individual states. And you will see here, the average rating was 68%. These are the states that were over that, and these are the states that were under that. And New Hampshire is actually right here.
Is that the number of people who are eligible
people who vote compared to the eligible?
There are a whole group of indicators. So it wasn't just one factor, and I'll show you what some of these indicators were. So if we, here, let me go back, because you can, the interesting part here is that you can go to so this is the rank, if I get it up, by state. Now you'll note, this is in 14, you'll note, so these are percentages grouped for all of the indicators. And you'll note that North Dakota is first. In all of these things, North Dakota is always first. Why is that? Well, that's basically the answer. There aren't very many people in North Dakota, and it's the only state in the Union that doesn't have voter registration. Right?
If they don't fill out the reports, they don't do wrong.
So, you walk into the precinct where everybody knows your name, and if they know you, you vote. And if they don't know you,
You still vote.
that's a nice question. So, but anyway, North Dakota is always first, and we're not there, but what state is always last in all of these voter analyses?
Illinois.
Mississippi is always last. I don't know what that says, but in any event, so here you see this rating running down from 84 to 70%. That gets you to Pennsylvania, and then here, here we go. We're down. Here's New Hampshire, 30th. So I think we think of ourselves as being pretty sophisticated in this area and doing pretty well. But according to this poll, you know, it's not bad, but it's not wonderful. We're in the middle somewhere. So, and then you'll note over here on this left side, these are some of the indicators. Military and overseas ballots rejected, unreturned, online registration available. So online registration is available in many states. It's not available in New Hampshire. And one of the reasons we've been able to quote unquote get away with it is because you can register on the day of the election here in New Hampshire. So to that extent, and in fact, New Hampshire and I think 3 other states have been able to basically excuse themselves from this requirement if they have a same-day registration. Post-election audit, provisional ballots, registration or absentee ballots, residual votes. There are votes here for processes for disabled folks. There are a whole series of these indicators. So,
Maynard,
yeah.
does that answer my question though? That's all, you know, they do a better job, they get more voters out there, it's easier to vote.
It doesn't speak to voter fraud.
No, it doesn't.
Doesn't speak to voter fraud. Yeah, we'll come back.
It's not Mississippi either, it's Alabama.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I apologize to Mississippi. Because I'm looking at it, I apologize to Mississippi. No, because you're right, it isn't.
How about California?
And California is way down here. So, anyway, so you're right, and I stand corrected. It's not the first time. So, no, it certainly won't. So, let's go back here. State profiles. Let's see if we can find New Hampshire here. Come on. Okay, state profiles. So,
Select a state.
first you have to find it on the map.
You can click on the little
Click
triangle.
on the arrow down there.
Oh, yes, thank you. What a good idea. Okay, here's New Hampshire. So, here's the... Here we go. So here are some of the key indicators. Data completeness, disability or illness-related voting problems. Note that these percentages are not all supposed to be 100%. There are different percentages for different indicators. So our disability or illness-related voting problems at 10% is a good thing, not a bad thing. Mail ballots rejected, unreturned, etc. And there's a whole series of these, so where the state is evaluating. And again, to Sam's point, there's nothing here in this discussion about voter fraud.
And that's probably because it's a non-issue. That's why it's not on it.
In most places, it has traditionally been a non-issue.
There could be one indicator for voter fraud is waiting time. If for example, in Ohio, they underestimate the number of voting machines needed only in certain districts, and there's a 3-hour wait. In Florida, my relative had to wait 4 hours online until almost midnight to vote in 2012.
And there have been places where that has happened, and in some cases, allegedly deliberately so, that is to say where and in some cases where the machines have broken down, and they simply haven't been able to fix them in a reasonable time.
But they have the voting waiting time at the bottom, I think, is one of the bottom.
Yes, that's correct. The voting is one of the, and I think they say that you should be able to vote within 5 minutes. Voting time, here's the average time is 5.2 minutes. So, yes.
Yes, I wonder if you could, would mind showing the same chart for Florida, because I sent them an absentee ballot, and I would like to see how many are rejected.
It was rejected?
No, but I would like to see what the percent of rejection.
Well, let me see if I can find this quickly. But I think 5.2 minutes is pretty good. I mean, when we used to vote in Boston, at the Boston Public Library, and this goes back many years ago, I mean, we stood in line for hours. It was no fun. So let me see if I can quickly find Florida here.
I'll wait here for you.
How about California too? Okay. I'm really surprised that they're.
Well, so here's Florida, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And hello. Well, that didn't work too well.
You need a 12-year-old up there to help.
I do. So let's come back down here.
Well, that's not bad.
So here's Florida. And, you know, they have data completeness at 100%. This disability is at 13.20, which is higher, which is not a good thing in the way they've calculated. Here's mail ballots rejected, small percentage, but still pretty high. Mail ballots unreturned. These are military and overseas ballots, etc. So my point here is that there's been a fair amount of analysis done on these kinds of matters. And there have been studies done, and I wanted to take you to another site here, if I can.
You have to say his name, or you won't remember his name.
Mayor?
Yeah.
When we talk about registration and voting,
Yes.
It's a personal responsibility, and in our country, almost like taxes, it's a self-regulated responsibility. I know for a fact that new students at Oberlin College in Ohio, when they register to start classes, can sign up in September of this year. They could sign up to vote in Ohio because they are residents there. They put down their dorm address and they vote in Ohio.
They can sign up.
They can sign up.
Yes.
And I also know for a fact that one young freshman who lives in McHenry, Illinois, was also registered as soon as she was 18 in Illinois. I don't think she's going to vote in both states, but unless Ohio and Illinois compare the voter registration, she could. And I think this is the kind of concern that some people can voice. Will that sway an election? I doubt it.
But it's an interesting, do Ohio
that exists. That's
well,
not
do Ohio and Illinois exchange that kind of information?
and I would doubt that they do.
So, let's take a minute and watch this.
And I am going to explain everything you need to know about hacking electronic voting machines. As we approach election day, how vulnerable are we, really? What are the problems? Most of these machines are running Windows XP, for which Microsoft has not released a security patch since April of 2014. Most of these were installed after the Bush-Gore recount debacle. Though there's no evidence of direct voting machine interference so far, researchers have determined that these machines are susceptible to malware, or equally, if not more alarming, a well-timed denial of service attack. So if you have machines that are working, that could create problems that prevent people from voting at all. The extent of vulnerability is not just hypothetical. Late last summer, Virginia decertified thousands of insecure WinVote machines. As one security researcher put it, anyone within half a mile could have modified every single vote undetected with no expertise. The WinVote scenario is an extreme case, but not an isolated.
I couldn't have done it.
What's the good news? First, it's important to realize that electronic voting machines aren't as commonplace as one might assume. 3/4 of the country will vote on paper ballots this fall. Only 5 states, Delaware, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and New Jersey, use direct record electronic, or DRE, machines exclusively, but plenty of other states use electronic voting in some capacity. VerifiedVoting.org has a handy map of who votes using what equipment. For what it's worth, electronic voting machines have been this hackable in previous elections, and there's no indication that there's ever been any interference. The even better news is the 3 states that may decide the election, Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, all have voting machines that are in relatively good shape. Suspicion that the results could be rigged, however, may be the real danger of electronic voting systems. If you can't guarantee that there was no tampering, and not every state can, it might not matter if any actually took place.
So, yes.
As far as registration, on most, and I know in Pennsylvania, one of the questions when you register says, have you registered someplace else?
Mm-hmm.
And if you mark yes, they ask you where. And then if that's marked off, the state then goes back.
Follows up.
Do they?
Well,
I don't know.
I guess the question is, I don't know either.
I don't either.
And I think, yes.
I almost registered here in New Hampshire from California, and then it got too complicated, but they said they would notify California if I did register here.
They would notify California.
Yes.
Yeah, I went as a supervisor's checklist, and we do notify, but it depends upon the person telling us that they were registered somewhere before and where they were registered.
Deborah?
Yeah, I heard NPR report that a good number of states do compare their votes with other states.
Well, you remember in the last class, we had a discussion about a number of the congressional bills that have been passed over the years to handle the administration of federal elections. And one of the purposes of those bills, major purposes, was to get the states to talk to one another. To what extent that has happened, I'm not able to evaluate at this point. I suspect that it's better than it was, but far from perfect. And to the point, the You know, if somebody comes to a polling place in New Hampshire on the election day to register, and is registered in California and has registered as maybe sent in an absentee ballot, who's to know? I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. Other comments? Yes.
But isn't it a felony? It's on, when you're registering, it says have you registered somewhere else. If you give false return of that, isn't that a felony?
Well, I don't know if it's a felony, but it certainly is, I'm sure it's a violation of the law.
And missing jail time, possible
Well,
jail time, possible fine.
it's possible. They have to find you first. So, other thoughts? Yes.
Well, getting back to the 33 or so that they did find, I didn't any analysis of exactly what they did find. I don't know if anybody else has, but I was just struck by the number 33, but that doesn't tell you how extensive the investigation was, whether they could really analyze any of the stuff we've just been talking about. It may go undetected.
So we all know, historically, that voter fraud, whatever that might be, was something that was winked at in many places in this country over a period of years. In Chicago, in Boston, in New York, at Tammany Hall, in Louisiana, and I suspect other places. So I think that we can't say it's never happened. But I think what we also can say is that the concept that the entire system is rigged, the 3,000 districts are rigged in concert, is foolish. Anybody who knows what's happening understands that can't possibly be. But we also know that when JFK was elected president, that Mayor Daley held back the number of votes in Chicago until he knew how many votes he needed to carry Illinois. And that in Louisiana and in Boston and in New York, over the years, dead people have been known to vote. So I think we can't really dismiss it out of hand, but I think we have to understand what it is we're talking about, and the difference between rigged and fragile, and, you know, needs adjustment, I think. And it's perception, because even before Donald Trump brought this up, I think the number was, it was more than half of the Americans in polls felt that the election system needed to be fixed, that they did not have complete faith in the system. Yes?
Well, the fraud also includes discouraging people from voting. And I know years ago there was a lot of concern about the media calling elections before half the country had finished voting.
In the eastern part of the state, so people in the west, why bother to go vote? And, of course, we know that another part of the system is the whole issue of gerrymandering these districts, which is a whole other issue, and the concept of voter ID now that's required in many of these states. And clearly, there has been an issue in many states to try and limit the number of voters of certain ethnic groups from actually casting a ballot. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Circumstance under which President Obama would continue. My brother or some relative or something told me and laid out this whole scenario. This would happen, that would happen, and it would end up with Obama.
Well, a president can't serve more than 2 full terms. And under the constitutional amendment, it was, I forget which one, obviously as a result of Roosevelt's 4 terms, there is a provision, and this went back to if Hillary, I mean this is silly, but if Hillary had nominated Bill as vice president and was elected, and then something happened to her, he could serve 2 years of her term before he would have to But that's a very limited, I'm not aware of any situation which would allow Mr. Obama to continue. If there is a deadlock for one reason or another, and nobody qualifies as president, and nobody qualifies as vice president before January 20th, the Congress will select an acting president. And it doesn't have to be the Speaker of the House. It could be anybody. So that's a nice, I'm sorry? Well, I think the answer is it could be, but I think the likelihood of that is extremely remote. It could be Mrs. Obama, but that's a whole other thing. So I think that, you know, we've never been in that situation, but there's no, well, that's true. So let's move this along. I want to, I don't know how many of you remember, there are some great old words which came out of World War II, which found their way into our vocabulary. So, snafu, for those of you who were in the Army, you may remember such a word. And, you know, this is not an uncommon word today. We use it for, but what this came from was situation normal, all fouled up. So, there's another one. Which is fouled up beyond all recognition. But my favorite, actually, is bohica, which is bend over, here it comes again. So, for the American voter, these are, maybe that won't appear in the video. Or maybe it will. Anyway, so I think that to get back to several things that, first, one of the things we've talked about is the possibility of a 50-50 Senate. So if we have a Senate that's 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats, who is the president of the Senate? Well, the president, the vice president, of course, chairs the Senate. But actually the real question is, who is the majority leader?
Mitch McConnell.
Well, he is at the moment. But if the Senate were to be 50-50, and if Hillary gets elected, who is the majority leader? So the answer to the question is, the majority leader is the person from the party of the vice president. So if Hillary got elected and the Senate was 50-50, Chuck Schumer would become the majority leader, even though it was 50-50. Now, historically, this actually hasn't happened too many times, and there was a short time when Gore was vice president, when the Senate was 50-50, and then let me just, in 2001, actually, Gore was VP, and on January 20th, Dick Cheney, remember him, became vice president. even though, and he became majority, well, he was VP. And then, so it was 50-50. And in May of that year, 2001, Jim Jeffers, who was a senator from Vermont, former classmate of mine, went from being a Republican to being a Democrat. And that shifted the balance in the Senate. It went from 51 to 49, and it gave the Democrats a one-vote advantage. In 1953, Bob Taft, who was the majority leader, died in office. He was the senator from Ohio. And the Ohio governor appointed a Democrat, a guy who was the mayor of Cleveland, I think, in his place. And that made it 48 Democrats, 47 Republicans, and there was an independent. And the independent, I think, was a guy named Wayne Morse from Oregon. And he agreed to caucus with the Republicans. So it was 48 to 48. And, but in any event, this doesn't happen very often, but that's what would happen if we were faced with that kind of a situation today. Let me go back. I really would like to play this for you. I think it's worth seeing. It's not long, and it's...
Do you have tissues?
Oh.
Good evening. Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time. I offered to meet with him as soon as possible so that we can start to heal the divisions of the campaign and the contest through which we just passed. Almost a century and a half ago, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who had just defeated him for the presidency, "Partisan feeling must yield to patriotism." I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you. Well, in that same spirit, I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country. Neither he nor I anticipated this long and difficult road. Certainly neither of us wanted it to happen. Yet it came, and now it is ended, resolved as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy. Over the library of one of our great law schools is inscribed the motto, "Not under man, but under God and law." That's the ruling principle of American freedom, the source of our democratic liberties. I've tried to make it my guide throughout this contest, as it has guided America's deliberations of all the complex issues of the past 5 weeks. Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession. I also accept my responsibility, which I will discharge unconditionally, to honor the new president-elect and do everything possible to help him bring Americans together in fulfillment of the great vision that our Declaration of Independence defines and that our Constitution affirms and defends. Let me say how grateful I am to all those who supported me and supported the cause for which we have fought. Tipper and I feel a deep gratitude to Joe and Hadassah Lieberman, who brought passion and high purpose to our partnership and opened new doors, not just for our campaign, but for our country. This has been an extraordinary election, but in one of God's unforeseen paths, this belatedly broken impasse can point us all to a new common ground, for its very closeness can serve to remind us that we are one people with a shared history and a shared destiny. Indeed, that history gives us many examples of contests as hotly debated as fiercely fought, with their own challenges to the popular will. Other disputes have dragged on for weeks before reaching resolution, and And each time, both the victor and the vanquished have accepted the result peacefully and in a spirit of reconciliation. So let it be with us. I know that many of my supporters are disappointed. I am too. But our disappointment must be overcome by our love of country. And I say to our fellow members of the world community, let no one see this contest as a sign of American weakness. The strength of American democracy is shown most clearly through the difficulties it can overcome. Some have expressed concern that the unusual nature of this election might hamper the next president in the conduct of his office. I do not believe it need be so. President-elect Bush inherits a nation whose citizens will be ready to assist him in the conduct of his large responsibilities. I personally will be at his disposal, and I call on all Americans. I particularly urge all who stood with us to unite behind our next president. This is America. Just as we fight hard when the stakes are high, we close ranks and come together when the contest is done. And while there will be time enough to debate our continuing differences, now is the time to recognize that that which unites us is greater than that which divides us. While we yet hold and do not yield our opposing beliefs, there is a higher duty than the one we owe to political party. This is America, and we put country before party. We will stand together behind our new president. As for what I'll do next, I don't know the answer to that one yet. Like many of you, I'm looking forward to spending the holidays with family and old friends. I know I'll spend time in Tennessee and mend some fences, literally and figuratively. Some have asked whether I have any regrets, and I do have one regret, that I didn't get the chance to stay and fight for the American people over the next 4 years, especially for those who need burdens lifted and barriers removed, especially for those who feel their voices have not been heard. I heard you, and I will not forget. I've seen America in this campaign, and I like what I see. It's worth fighting for, and that's a fight I'll never stop. As for the battle that ends tonight, I do believe, as my father once said, that no matter how hard the loss, defeat may serve as well as victory to shake the soul and let the glory out. So for me, this campaign ends as it began, with the love of Tipper and our family, with faith in God and in the country I have been so proud to serve, from Vietnam to the vice presidency, and with gratitude to our truly tireless campaign staff and volunteers, including all those who worked so hard in Florida for the last 36 days. Now the political struggle is over, and we turn again to the unending struggle for the common good of all Americans and for those multitudes around the world who look to us for leadership in the cause of freedom. In the words of our great hymn, America, America, let us crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. And now, my friends, in a phrase I once addressed to others, it's time for me to go. Thank you, and good night, and God bless America.
Can you imagine Donald Trump giving that speech?
Pretty good, I think. Pretty good. And, you know, it would be nice to think that we would see something like that again.
Not be Hillary doing it.
So I went back and did a little research just to, I was curious, when Winston Churchill was defeated right after World War II, after he had led the British through this incredible war that they had fought and suffered with. Polling day was on July 5th, and it didn't look good, but it took 3 weeks for the vote to finally come in because they were waiting for the ballots from the British soldiers who were overseas. And in any event, in the interim, Churchill took a trip to Bordeaux, and then he met Truman for the first time, and Stalin. Well, he met Truman, and then they agreed to use the atom bomb against Japan. And on July 25th, I think they were in Potsdam, Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. And Churchill left on the 25th and went home to England. And on the 28th, Clement Attlee went to Berlin as Prime Minister. And in Churchill's final speech at that point, we all know that he came back. One of the things he said was, "I thank the British people for the many kindnesses shown me during these years." So this tradition is not something that is limited just to us. And we have had examples. Actually, George Bush at a press conference after, not directly following, but afterwards, made the comment, "I've built up all this political capital." That was, I think, the phrase he used. "And I intend to spend it." And spend it he did. So, in any event, I think that this is a continuing problem. It's an issue which I'm afraid the country is going to have to deal with. And I think that I don't know how this is going to turn out. And I don't know whether Mr. Trump is going to start his own television network, if that's what he chooses to do, if in fact he loses this election. But I do really think this. I think that November 8th is not the end of anything. I think that no matter who wins this election, it really is only the beginning, to use another quote from Mr. Churchill, the end of the beginning. Because I think that going forward, if Mr. Trump is in Washington, who knows what will happen. But even if Hillary goes to Washington, I think that this country is going to be in a very difficult position, even if the Democrats take over the Senate. I think that the attitude that's being expressed by a number of the Republicans about Supreme Court nominees and about other issues suggests that the continuation of tension and do-nothing congressional activities is only going to intensify. And so I think we're in for a long, hard struggle. And I really do not believe that this election will have solved anything. So, on that happy note, let's move on. I want to spend a little time talking about a subject that we keep referring to, but actually haven't spent much time looking at, money. Because, as we all know, money is what moves all of this. And I don't know whether you've noted that in September, Mr. Trump raised $100 million. Hillary raised $150 million. So those are sizable sums of money. We all know about, let me see here, which way do I go?
Couple more. Don't need 100.
Where are you? Whoop. I'm not sure that's the right one. Sorry. Give me a sec. So, the problem with raising money, first of all, we've talked about tracking, here we go, this is what I want. So this is a recent summary of funds raised to date. And you'll note here, you'll remember that Mr. Trump made a huge deal at the beginning of the campaign that this was all going to be self-funded. Well, that's gone away. And I had to chuckle at the last debate when he said to Hillary, why don't you throw in $30 or $40 million? Because the $50 million that he's thrown in, he says he's forgiven, but to the best of my knowledge, he's never filed that form that's required to be filed, which would in fact forgive the loan. And I'd be willing to bet quite a bit that he ain't gonna file that form. So here we go, and incidentally, I don't think that these numbers include the 100 or the 150 that Hillary and Donald raised in September. This number is actually a mid-September number, but I don't think that those totals are included here. So this is what the campaign had raised to date. Remember, the campaign is different from the PACs and super PACs in particular. And this is what the super PACs had raised. So the total raised, total spent, cash on hand. Here we had Trump raising $372 million, and then the super PACs, much smaller, and the total raise and the cash on hand. So what happens, of course, is in the last few months, that's when the most money is spent. So now, what I think is important here to note is that the last presidential campaign between Obama and Romney was the first one in which the candidates raised $1 billion. $1 billion. How preposterous, really, is that? And this one is definitely going to be, I think, Hillary's numbers are going to be well beyond that. I think the Republican numbers, it's interesting, it's not clear yet. They may fall short of what Romney actually raised because of the issues that the Republican National Committee has had with Mr. Trump. But let me...
None of these numbers add up. If we assume that the amount raised minus amount spent should be cash on hand.
Well, no, but these are, you know, the answer is that they're, this is a complicated matter. These are, this is a, so, these are, don't worry about their adding up because they're not going to add up. But they'll give you a rough idea as to what, so these are the money, these are the funds in August. And you can see, again, this was 57 to 40, and then in September it was 100 and 150. Again, rough numbers. So, now, I want to talk for a minute about outside money, because this is this is really, you all have heard of Citizens United, the famous case that was decided by the Supreme Court, which basically ruled that for the purposes of campaign financing, corporations were citizens, and that they could contribute unlimited sums of money. Actually, that decision didn't say that, but subsequent decisions said that. Unlimited sums of money to campaigns, so long as the super PAC did not coordinate with the campaign.
Yeah.
So, what happens, of course, is that they do coordinate with the campaign. I mean, there's no question about it. At least in many cases, they coordinate with the campaign. How hard is it to send an email or pick up a telephone or walk next door to the adjoining office? So here are the, this is a list of just a few of the super PACs supporting Clinton, so they have raised, as of August, this particular PAC had raised 130 million, and this one then 14. And over here, these numbers are significantly less, but not totally insignificant. And the other point is that the people making the contributions, in many cases, depending upon how the money comes in, do not necessarily have to be disclosed. In this case, or in these cases, these are the top donors, as of August, to the Clinton campaign and to the Trump campaign and PACs. So if you know any of these people, you should become friendly with them. Now, this includes donations to campaign committees, joint fundraising committees, and allied super PACs. And so, now let's look at how this money is spent. You know, do we just buy ties or drinks? Or what do we do with all of it? So, of course, much of it goes to advertising. And I assume Mr. Trump is spending a lot of money on hats. And this is an indication of cash on hand. Obviously, this will drop substantially as it's spent. Media placement. These are the top categories for the Trump campaign. Oh, well, hats aren't too far off here. $2 million for baseball hats. Okay, so, well, it includes buttons, freight. This stuff has to come in from China. Actually, I'm told the hats are made in the United States. Right? In any event, so digital consulting, that must be the guy who's sending out the Twitter. And media placement, travel. Now, a lot of this travel and some of the other fees, as best we know, is going back to Trump because he's billing the campaign for the use of his airplane.
And his hotel.
And, right, and when he stays at Trump hotels, and maybe even when he doesn't, so there are a lot of fees that have yet to be accounted for, in a sense. But in any event, that's so. And then further, we can also find out who the vendors are, major vendors. Note that I don't see any Trump names here, but he's got this private jet service is probably his. In any event, The charter team may very well be. So this is a breakdown, a quick breakdown of how he's spending his money. And then here's the media buy for the Clinton campaign, $141 million. This was in August. And here's how that broke down. And again, I know this doesn't add up to 141 million, but don't worry about that. The accountants will take care of that. So these are, again, this will give you an idea of how these funds are spent.
Did Donald have payroll taxes on his?
I'm sorry?
Did Donald have payroll taxes on his?
I didn't notice, but I don't think Donald pays taxes. So.
Well, credit card payments could be.
Anything. That's anything.
That could be anything.
Yeah, yeah, that's anything. Right. So, so that's.
That could be paying off other people.
So that's one kind of one quick summary. Now there are a number of sites, if you're interested, that you can spend time on. One, of course, is the Federal Election Commission, whose responsibility it is to keep track of all of this. And the site is not a bad site. If we have time here today, we'll go on it briefly. But a site that really does an excellent job is something called OpenSecrets.org. The Center for Responsive Politics. This is a nonprofit organization that keeps track of, or tries to keep track of, the total amounts raised. Now, look at this for financial activity for super PACs for 2016. This is billions. $2.2 billion raised by super PACs and 1.5 spent by super PACs. Now, that's not just for presidential elections. That's for the presidential primaries, and it's for senatorial elections, and for those House elections where they have super PACs, and there are many. So, but I think, I mean, these numbers, I don't know how they affect you, but these numbers are staggering. And when you consider, if we're talking about Congress, that something like 90+% of the elected representatives in Congress are returned to office every 2 years, something like 40 run unopposed, and so these numbers are a staggering recognition of what has happened to our system. This is another way in which I would argue the system may not be rigged, but it's sure broken. Because the fact that this money can be raised, can be utilized in New Hampshire. We have a Senate race. We had one 2 years ago with Jean Shaheen and Scott Brown. How much money was spent here? It was over 100 million, well over 100 million in that race. And 95%, more than 95% of that money came from out of state.
The Koch brothers poured tons of money into the race against Shaheen.
So there's, I'm told, I haven't seen the numbers, I'm told there's even more money. I don't think it's coming from Koch this time. I'm told there's even more money being spent on this race between Kelly Ayotte and Maggie Hassan. And, you know, I say to myself, now, the first question is, why should somebody in Montana be spending money to elect a senator for us? And, you know, so, but it goes beyond that, I think, because in addition to these super PACs, we have a system where we have 501c4 organizations. A C3 is a charitable organization, like Dartmouth College, or like the Cancer Society, or any organization to which you give money and take a tax deduction. Those are 501c3s. 501c4s are a different category of the tax code. They are called social welfare organizations. And the IRS has said that if you are a social welfare organization promoting certain kinds of activities, that you can spend significant sums of money on political activities without disclosing your donors. So what has happened is, remember, you're reading now about the possibility of impeaching the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. That's in the news. And the reason Congress wants to impeach, the right-wing Republicans want to impeach the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, is because they blame him for, quote unquote, targeting resources on right-wing 501c4 social welfare organizations, and for not permitting them to become either approved organizations, or for trying to get them to live up to the letter of the law. So there are hundreds of millions of dollars that are going into these social welfare organizations where you do not know who the donors are. And so let me see if I can find this for you. Do I have a question?
The thing that strikes me is Hillary's raised a whole lot of money, more money from super PACs, which leads me to believe that people with a head on their shoulders are actually putting their money, I'm a little prejudiced here.
Well, head on their shoulders, yes, Mark.
I was going to say that you may want to also add the fact that the commissioner of the IRS that they want to impeach was not in that office
when all of that happened.
When all of that happened, so it's.
So this is kind of a rough breakdown. Again, you know, these are numbers that keep changing. So the super PACs here, we have 788 million. There are the social welfare organizations, trade associations, 25 billion. Now, here's one for you. Until 2 years ago, the National Football League was a 501c6 organization. The National Football League, which makes, I forget the last number, I think it's more than $10 billion a year. Net's more than $10 billion. Paid no taxes as a league because they were a 501c6. And finally, it's a wonderful story. Finally, they got it, and they've registered as a quote-unquote for-profit corporation. But in any event, trade associations, that's the Chamber of Commerce, that's other organizations of that type. Then unions, and then the parties here. you know, what's happened to the parties is very interesting. The parties used to be the source of most funds, and now they've dried up because the funding is all, or mostly, not all, but mostly going to a whole series of other things. And so the parties are having trouble raising funds to do the kinds of things that they used to. And then you've got other here, which is the corporations, individual people, and so-called other groups. So these numbers, again, remain fluid. They keep going up. Here are groups. You may have heard about some of these groups. You may have seen their names in the news. These are, I think, these are mostly, well, here's a liberal group, but these others, and the Senate majority is, these three are conservative groups. The C is not for classified.
So
It's for conservative, yes.
all these groups do not pay taxes because.
Oh no, there are no taxes here.
Okay.
No
so
taxes.
We have to put up the churches that do political activity and put their money towards, you know, different candidates.
Well, we haven't put them up. They may or may not be, and the churches are actually treated kind of in a separate category, and I haven't taken the time to study those numbers. But if they're anywhere, they would be in that other group that I just showed. I suspect, and don't know, that it's probably a totally different other category. I don't know whether anybody keeps track of those numbers. If anybody does, it would be open secrets, and you could check by going on and seeing if churches falls out of here. Yes?
Who would make a decision on why that money goes to the parties? I'm just thinking.
Well, this money doesn't go to the parties. This money would all go, this says excluding party committees, this money would go to PACs or super PACs, candidates, or it would go to what they call voter education, getting out the vote. You know, those kind of vague phrases which basically mean, well, I'm not sure what they mean.
Well, I'm just thinking, we could pay off a lot of debt, that's taxpayer.
Well, we could do a lot of things with that money. What about infrastructure? What about a million things? I mean, there's no question about it. So, I think I would close, and we're not finished with this discussion. We haven't even mentioned 527s, which is another area of the tax code under which an organization can form and contribute money. And I think the point I would leave you with is that it used to be, way back in the day, that it was very simple. You could make a contribution to a candidate, or you could make a contribution to the party, and the contributions were never tax deductible. And for a long time, the party and the candidate disclosed, voluntarily disclosed, what they received. If you go back to the days of Teddy Roosevelt, and that's a fair time ago, he actually published in the paper a list of donors and amounts. Think of that. Think of that. I mean, we're so far removed from that today that it's incredible. And now the whole purpose is to try and obfuscate and confuse and make certain that you can't know. We can't know. The public can't know. The public shouldn't know. And the Supreme Court and Congress have been in league on this matter. There are there are some people in Congress who don't believe in this. It's been a part of the Democratic platform now for a while. But the truth is that nobody in Congress is doing anything to change this existing.
Wait till Feingold gets there.
Bob?
I was just going to say that the amounts of money are such that it's highly unlikely that anyone, Democratic platform or not, is going to kill that golden goose.
I wouldn't
Feingold.
disagree. Well,
Feingold's one guy.
but you know, that had, we'll talk about that next time. There are some people who really believe this. So, unbelievably, this election is 19 days away. We have 3 classes left, 2 of them before the election, and 1, as you remember, the day after, that's been scheduled. So tonight is the Roughhouse Bowl, or whatever we're going to call it. I don't know what's going to happen. I certainly don't.
The mud wrestle.
And I don't think that the results will be a big mover on the polls, but there's no way to know. So you know, everybody, I think, is tired and exhausted and wishes it was over, but it ain't over, and I still think it ain't over till it's over. So I would urge you to continue to follow all of this. Just to remind you, we have reserved this room for the 18th of November, which is the Friday prior to the week of Thanksgiving. It was the only day this room was available for a month after our last class, which is scheduled on the 9th. We don't have to make a decision today, but the thought was maybe we could have kind of a roundup and a regroup and a heavy breathing exercise. Maybe we can do yoga here. And have a chance to unwind a little after the election is over. So if some of you are available, we can consider that, and if not, we'll just wind up on November 9th. Thank you very much, and have a great day.